So the Buddha mentions the word Samadhi, which is generally translated as concentration or something like that. Do you think that's a mostly adequate word to translate it, or do you think there's something more appropriate that kind of describes the Pali word Samadhi?
Well, there's nothing wrong with a term concentration in itself, but the problem today is, due to many popularized meditation techniques and the contemporary take on the whole meditation practice, usually concentration ends up misrepresenting what was meant by Samadhi, and certainly prevents people from correctly doing it very often. So the better word for Samadhi would be composure, because the whole notion of Samadhi in itself means keeping things together, binding together, and you can say concentration means you bring something together, but it has much more narrower connotations than if you would say composure, something that you have to compose and then maintain that composition. That takes different type of effort than the effort of focusing and effort of concentration. So, and also concentration can kind of indicate for people you concentrate on something, so you switch everything else out. But it's more like you compose yourself above everything else altogether, so that nothing can bother you in that sense. Not because you shut it all out, but because you have gone beyond it.
So when people usually from a commentarial point of view talk about Samadhi, it generally brings up this idea of a meditation object. The Visuddhimagga, for example, lists 40 so-called objects ranging from kasinas to various recollections of the Triple Gem and so on and so forth, that one becomes absorbed in and focuses on as much as possible. And the common technique is you lose your focus and then you bring yourself back to the meditation object. Is there any validity in that practice, or are you saying that it's kind of fundamentally misguided?
It's a completely wrong direction to go by if you want to develop your mind. If you want to practice concentration in a sense of concentration, that's fine, but the type of composure that the Buddha was encouraging and talking about is the one that's founded upon mindfulness. And usually if people do concentration practice, Samadhi practice in terms of focusing, it requires you to focus on the particular, as in the object of your meditation, and you keep trying to observe it as closely as possible. And that inevitably has to result in losing the sight of the general awareness in regard to what you were doing, which is focusing on a particular object. So what I'm saying is that if you are chasing the object, you cannot be mindful of doing that. While if you start looking at the nature of object, the background of the arisen particular experience, you are actually playing along the basis of mindfulness that the Buddha did say you can't have too much of, and it's a good thing to develop.
So it seems almost like almost an opposite of absorption, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can say absorption, but it's not absorption in one point that shuts everything else out. It's absorption in the more general point that includes everything else in. That's why the Buddha gave such similes like a gatekeeper or a man who is too old who needs to look after the children, but he's too old to chase them individually. If he chases one child, he loses the sight of all the other children in the yard. So what you do, you find a place from which you can see them all at the same time. Not to the same extent, but at the same time. In the same sense that a gatekeeper would know. He wouldn't chase people who come through the gate into the fenced off area, because he knows, I don't need to chase them, I know that they're inside, and that's all I need to know. That's why any practice of mindfulness that results in the correct practice of composure, the Buddha would say, he knows there is a pleasant feeling present as pleasant. So he knows, oh, there is a pleasant feeling, or oh, there is an unpleasant feeling, there is a neutral feeling, oh, there is a depressed mind present, or there is a elated mind present. All of that results in complete fulfillment of the Satipatthana, which results in fulfillment of Samadhi as well. So it's quite the opposite than if you were to say, oh, there is a elated mind present in regard to this experience or that experience, or why is it elated? Because of this is elated, and what did that result in, and what did it bring to be, and so on. It's actually, you stop being concerned with a particular content and you just look at the general nature of it, and that's the beginning of Samadhi. So whether you're sitting cross-legged, whether you're doing walking meditation, whether you're standing or laying down, mindfulness and Samadhi basically are inseparable if done rightly, and there's certainly mindfulness, unwavering mindfulness is what your Samadhi becomes. So it's not that you must focus on something else that will then result in your Samadhi and then you go back to practice your mindfulness. Mindfulness, when developed, that's what Samadhi is. And that's why with that kind of general knowledge of the nature that is present in regard to any particular thing, that's exactly how you develop Vipassana. That's why Samatha and Vipassana go hand in hand. You cannot possibly separate. By having the correct Samatha, correct calmness in regard to that composure, means the clarity of the nature of things is present because you're not absorbed, you're not pulled by the content. So your insight in regard to that nature is being developed through that samatha. And equally, if you focus on the insight of the nature of the things, knowing and discerning that nature means you're composing the right mindfulness right there and then. So again, then Samadhi and your samatha gets developed through your Vipassana, in the correct sense of that word.
Typically, there's also this idea given of like so-called stages or steps of Samadhi. The commentaries mention things like access concentration preceding Jhana and a momentary concentration, things like that. So, I mean, we don't have to go into those specifically unless you want to, but in terms of, I guess, is there a way to kind of quantify like more or less Samadhi, or is that kind of misguided to start measuring to begin with?
Yeah, you can't measure it because it would require you to step outside of yourself and somehow magically measure the extent of your concentration, which is, well, inconceivable. And then secondary, you never find any of that stuff in the suttas. When the Buddha did talk about meditation, he was always in, it was in very different terms than the terms that came later with the commentarial and a kind of contemporary Buddhist technique meditation, where you're catching the moments, observing them, trying to sort of get the right pure perception that will sort of tell you the truth behind the appearances and so on. All of that, I think we covered that in other talks, but all of that kind of assumes you, not being aware of yourself to begin with, which means you're not mindful of the general background, and then secondary also, it is all very often founded upon the external view of yourself, as if you can observe the pure moment, for example, that's independent of your experience as a whole. That would require you to somehow step outside of it, and that's just inconceivable. It's conceivable only in the form of wrong conception, which is why it's a wrong view.
That leads to also, obviously, the Buddha distinguishes, we could say, between a wrong samadhi and a right samadhi, insofar as there is a wrong eightfold path and a right eightfold path. So what is it specifically that makes one's samadhi right as opposed to not?
It's that direction that I'm talking about. If your samadhi is concerned with composing the nature of things to be present and endure in your experience, that's the right samadhi, or samadhi along the right lines. If your composure, concentration is concerned around focusing on the particular or whatever it's in front of you, and then within further particular, within that particular, you're basically like preying upon something, you're hunting down the moment, chasing it, catching it, trying to see it in its arising, and that's a completely wrong direction. That's why the Buddha did say, gave that comparison, like when a person doesn't know how to meditate rightly, he mismeditates, premeditates, undermeditates, overmeditates, so to speak. He cannot meditate, and then he says it's like an owl preying upon, waiting for a mouse to show its head so he can grab it, so he can catch it, so he can witness it, whatever you want to call it. But the attitude is the same, or like a cat catching a fish or something like that. So ends up, if your meditation ends up being about trying to perceive things in that sort of hunting manner, like you're trying to catch it, I must not miss, I must not blink, because the moment will slip me. I must catch every moment as it arises. That's why the Buddha did compare that same thing to actually an animal hunting its prey. And because of that, he said, that person who meditates like that, he meditates with sensuality. Why? Because it's fully based upon the domain of the senses. So that's why that samadhi is wrong. As I was explaining in another talk, people often sort of will disagree with it because, well, I find it helpful. But first of all, unless a person is already sotapanna, you don't know what true helpfulness is. So nobody's denying the relative benefit, but I'm highlighting the fact that it can only be a relative benefit, in a sense of it's a circumstantial benefit. The focusing practice can only have a circumstantial benefit to one's peace of mind. If one is looking for a long-term solution, needs to go the other direction that includes the nature of the arisen phenomena, the nature of the arisen experience, which is where the nature of unwholesome is. So becoming skilled in seeing things in that general manner, seeing the background behind a particular appearance that is simultaneously present with it, that's how you develop the understanding of the nature of whatever's present in front of you.
So related to that, here is a sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. It's called the Saddha Sutta. And the Buddha is giving these instructions to a Venerable Saddha. He says, meditate like a thoroughbred horse, not like an inferior horse. And how does one meditate like an inferior horse? When an inferior horse is tied up to the feeding trough, he meditates hay, hay, like H-A-Y-A. For what reason? Because when an inferior horse is tied up to the feeding trough, he does not ask himself, what will the horse trainer make me do today? How will I respond? Tied up to the feeding trough, he meditates, hey, hey. In the same way, Saddha, a certain inferior man, having gone to the forest, the root of a tree, an empty dwelling, dwells with a mind possessed of sensual passion, overcome by sensual passion, and does not understand as it really is the escape from arisen sensual passion. From within this very sensual passion which he has produced, he meditates, he ponders, he frets, he is overwhelmed. And the same thing for all the other 5 hindrances. In this way, Saddha, one is a man who meditates like an inferior horse.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been saying now. That's like, in the case of a horse who is not an inferior horse, he wouldn't just look at what's right in front of him, which is hay, hay. He would think, what's implied in this? What will the horse trainer make me do today? Yeah, he brought this hay for me, but that means something. What is the background of this presently arisen experience for me? He's not just concentrating on what he wants. And often, that's why often people approach, they have a wholesome motivation, they have a right motivation, but they end up approaching meditation just to pure sensuality, just to trying to get rid of the unpleasant feeling or the possibility of unpleasant feeling arising, just through sheer sort of replacement with a good feeling that I can keep on, I can just maintain it forever, and I'll never experience any lack of peace or discomfort. But the true peace and freedom from discomfort comes from understanding the nature of feelings, all the feelings, not just replacing one with the other. That's why people would go through, like often, to different ajahns and different techniques and different retreats, just trying to rekindle different novelty, different sort of scenarios. They will be able to replace their unpleasant existential feelings, or they have to keep re-intensifying their focusing practices and so on, which then obviously results in some other drawbacks. So as that sutta says, you actually reflect. Even in Samadhi, the whole point of it is to see bigger picture, not to be absorbed and concentrated upon right what's in front of your nose.
So generally when the Buddha talks about samadhi, it always seems to be in the context of a path, like a gradual path. Like obviously there's a Noble Eightfold Path, and there's a number of suttas such as Majjhima Nikaya 39, the Greater Discourse at Asapura, that gives like a gradual training that starts with things like purifying one's conduct and leads one all the way to final nibbana, leading through the hindrances and jhanas. So I won't read the whole sutta, but just generally give the outline. It starts with telling one to develop shame and fear of wrongdoing, to restrain one's bodily conduct, restrain one's verbal conduct, restrain one's mental conduct, practice restraint of the senses, moderation in eating, wakefulness, mindfulness and full awareness.
So see, all of those things, so I can just interject, is what's prepping you for becoming more accustomed to dealing and seeing the background. Because a non-restrained person is the person who goes with a particular content of their experience, which is a definition of sensuality. And so even if you become restrained beforehand, your views are still pertaining to the sensual domain, which is how people often end up expecting to perceive the right moment and the moment of meditation and so on. So that's why all of this is a necessary prerequisite, because just by engaging in restraint, mindfulness, wakefulness, a verbal restraint, mental restraint as well, you are actually stepping back into that more general picture and refusing to be pulled and fully absorbed by the content. And then samadhi should just be the extension of that, which is why it's a prerequisite for samadhi, not for something else. But what most people end up doing is being very virtuous, very restrained, but when it comes to samadhi, they go back into same type of focusing, just a different object. But the attitude of you staring at the object stays the same. Even if that object tries to be a lofty general background or some generic idea or like a earth element or kasina, you're doing it in a sensual manner through trying to perceive it and focus on it. You're not stepping into it, you're actually trying to absorb yourself into what you think it is. Which is why it's also inseparable from the view. So if you think it's a wrong thing, means your meditation will be wrong. Sorry, if you think it's a thing that actually it isn't, your meditation will be wrong because you think it wrongly. You think this is what samadhi is, this is what composure is, but it isn't. And because of that, all of your efforts will be equally wrong.
So it sounds like if you understand what it means to be restrained and all these other prerequisites, you do understand samadhi.
Yeah. Well, understanding what it means to be restrained, understanding the place of restraint, it's already the beginning of samadhi, beginning of composure. That's what Buddha was saying. Once the skilled monk would establish his mind, and then he said, like even in the first jhana, he said whether he walks, sits down, eats, urinates or defecates, whatever he does, it's divine, because his mind is in such a lofty established state. But you can't do that if you're just focused on one thing and you forget about yourself entirely. Now, of course, you can get so established to the point of cessation of perception and feeling. But again, that's the ultimate point that includes everything else that can ever arise, ever has arisen, ever will arise in this world. The ultimate nature of everything is perception and feeling, which is what determines your experience in the most general manner of your mind. So that's why whenever they would progress through these different establishments, higher establishments of the mind in terms of the jhanas and so on, then the infinite space, they would come down to perception and feeling, and then, oh, there is no higher than this. Literally, that is surmounting the phenomenological world, basically, in every shape or form. It doesn't matter. So it's in a sense of the utmost general thing. It's to be felt and to be perceived. Otherwise it doesn't exist. So when people think about things that they haven't perceived or felt, well, their thoughts are being felt and perceived, which means ultimately if you come to the root of the experience is the perception and the feeling, which is why the Buddha said the mind is the forerunner of all things. It determines basically the direction of your thought and whether you're going to be aware of the nature in regard to it or just be focused on the particular.
So from there, the sutta talks about abandoning the 5 hindrances. Those are covetousness or sensuality, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness, remorse, and doubt, as they're generally translated. And the Buddha gives various similes about that too. Like he says, suppose a man were to take a loan and undertake business, and his business were to succeed, so that he could repay all the money of the old loan, and there would remain enough extra to maintain a wife. Then on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. So too, when these 5 hindrances are unabandoned in himself, a bhikkhu sees them respectively as a debt, and so on with the other similes. So these hindrances, can you just kind of start by saying, just to like, well, what are they hindering exactly? What makes them hindering?
Well, they hinder the establishment of the mind on that general nature of things. They sort of narrow you down. They hinder you. They sort of bring you down into that more particular direction. Obviously, more of a hindrance means more of a binding for your mind. It is more of that kind of tunnel vision towards one particular content. You can have weakened hindrances, in which case the mind would still be able to the hindrances can be weakened as well, in which case the mind can still be aware of the general background and have like a degree of the pull of those hindrances in terms of degree of the clouding, so to speak. Once the mind is free from hindrances, what you doing? Once the mind is completely free from hindrances, the mind can be established upon the general nature of things without being absorbed and pulled by the content. Because that's the thing, that's what's in common to every hindrance. It's a certain contextual pull, so to speak. You're pulled by a content, as in content of your doubt, sensuality, ill will. You can't just have ill will without any particular object of your ill will. It's going to end up being pinned down onto something. So that's what all the hindrances have in common. They're taking you in the direction of the content. They're taking you in the direction of sensuality, which is why they're directly against the proper samadhi, proper establishment of the mind.
So by doing all the things previously, like the restraint and the moderation and eating and whatnot, is it almost like strengthening your mind against hindrances? It's a preparation. It's like you won't see a hindrance if you habitually you're already well within acting within the contextual pull. If you're pulled by the content and you had no restraint, you had no self-reflection, means you're not aware of the hindrance. For you, it's just you and the content. So you have to stop exercising behavior that's already bound with the content of your senses, which is the sense restraint. Once you do that, then the general nature of that pull of a hindrance, that's when it becomes revealed. And that's why usually people would give in to the content. It's because bearing that pull of that hindrance is unpleasant, and they don't know any other way of overcoming it. So the only other way is to forget about it through giving in to the content. Then, having abandoned the hindrances, the Buddha talks about going into the 4 jhanas, then having the 3 true knowledges, the knowledge of past lives, knowledge of beings being born, passing away, and knowledge of Four Noble Truths, and one becoming an arhat on the basis of that. I was planning to ask more about like jhana in general in a later video, but with regards to this gradual path, it doesn't sound like it's like a linear thing, so to speak, in terms of like you get sila to 95% and then you progress to restraint or something.
It's a perpendicular thing. So in that sense you can say linear, but Not linear in a sense that you can observe the line. So it's perpendicular because, well, it goes right through your being, right through your point of view. That's what establishment of mind is. That's why developing the general background that sort of transcends your limited point of view that you have cultivated through engagement with the senses. So in that sense, yeah, there is a certain gradual development, but it's not linear, exactly like, oh, now I do 1, then I do 2, then I do 3, then I do 4, 5, 6, 7. That's why I often say it's not a mechanical method, which is usually how many people would like to approach their meditation. Just tell me what to do and what to look for, so I don't have to think about anything.
There's another kind of elicitation of a less broad but still, I guess, gradual path. It comes up in a few different places, but this one in particular is from the Samanapala Sutta from Digha Nikaya number 2. It goes much the same as the previous sutta, just more expansive. And then after it talks about the hindrances being abandoned, it says, seeing that these 5 hindrances have been abandoned in himself, delight arises. When he is delighted, bliss arises. That's piti. When his mind is blissful, his body becomes tranquil. Tranquil in body, he feels happiness. Being happy, his mind becomes composed. And then from there it starts talking about jhanas. So what kind of delight and bliss and happiness are we referring to here? Because it seems to me that perhaps it's not what we necessarily think of when we initially think of those terms.
Yeah, that's because most often those terms are inseparable from sensuality. The sensual joy on account of gaining, having things, seeing things, hearing things, tasting things, touching things, smelling things. And this is completely the opposite direction of that. So that's why by recognizing the extent of sensuality, the extent of that contextual, perceptual pull, and because it's a pull means you're kind of enslaved to it. So that's why by recognizing it, by fully discerning it, you free yourself from it. And that's why the Buddha would say that somebody who is free from those hindrances, from that kind of pull, he experienced joy, because you really feel like you're that free now. Oh, there is no more burden pressuring you or dragging or pulling you in that sort of threatening manner, which means you're free from it, which then means you're free from the entire scope of things that you used to have to do on account of sensuality, just because you were a victim, you were a subject to that displeasing amount of pull in the background of your mind. So naturally then, being free from that kind of burden, that kind of pressure, it feels like a relief. So that relief it's a joyous thing. And that relief results in calmness, in seeing things clearly, because you're relieved now, you don't have anything to worry about.
How about when it mentions like the body being tranquil? Like how do we think about that in a non-sensual way, like getting a massage or something?
Well, no, that's still sensual, isn't it?
Right, that's what I'm saying. How do we think about it in a non-sensual way?
Right, well, it means the tranquility that comes out of freedom from hindrances, that relief is felt in the body. So in that sense, the body is tranquil, the body is calm, the body is pleasant. And that, I'm pretty much describing the pleasure that Buddha described of the first jhana, like just to the right amount. So not spilling out of your senses, but not denying them either. So they're just left alone there. And the Buddha gave the simile. What was the simile? Like a
bath powder.
Yeah, that's it. Bath powder, adding water to it, and then you get the right consistency. It's not too much water, not too little water. And you can get that not by sort of measuring the powder, but basically by knowing what too much and too little is. So in the sense for your body, you know the extent of sensual involvement, and then you know the extent of non-involvement. And to that extent, so you don't need to then you don't need to go further and deny the body more than that. You've restrained it, the mind has surmounted the hindrances, and now these senses are left. That there's there is no intent, there is no attitude, there is no action that is at the time present that is founded in the senses towards the sense objects. They are left alone, just for what they are, which means they are pressure free and relieved of a burden of the pull of the sense objects. But you won't get there if you've been trying to deny them either, because you can't indulge them, but you can't deny them in the same manner, because either way you choose to do, you're going to end up being involved, overly involved or underly involved with them, which means it's either too much water or too little water, which means there is still pressure, either negative or positive, but the pressure is still there.
So we established that there's a, so to speak, a gradual path, gradual training to establishing the mind and composing the mind. It's sometimes said that one enters, let's say, jhana, but really any kind of establishment of samadhi, kind of in a natural way, like you just do keep sila well, restrain, and then these things arise naturally, so to speak. Is that the case here? We wait for things to arise as they do, like
well,
the establishments?
If by naturally you mean automatically, no, not necessarily. You need to know. Well, you need to understand the nature of establishment of mind. You need to understand the nature of right composure. It can't just happen to you. It can't just happen to you. Or if something happens to you, it's not the composure, because you haven't been composing it. So yes, there is a whole set of prerequisites that you must develop and maintain, but then also knowing that it's about the background of the particularly arisen experience, the general nature behind it. That's what you're supposed to discern it, without making it a foreground, without overly attending it, without ignoring it, without under-attending it either. And that's something that you need to know. And if you know, that's how you can compose it then eventually through that practice. It will not necessarily automatically result in it. Although, if you have really perfected the sense restraint and wakefulness and mindfulness, inevitably you will start looking in that direction, because you're already significantly withdrawn from the pull of the particular sense content. But yes, it's not guaranteed. It would be good if there is some instruction. You might get a hint of it or something, but then you would actually have to willingly turn there and go that way. That's actually that's even what the Buddha done. When he was trying to figure out what could be the way of developing the mind fully, properly, he remembered that kind of pleasant, peaceful, burden-free, pressure-free experience he had under the tree when he was still young. And he thought, well, what if I go that way? And then by going that way, we actually understood it, developed it, and so on. Another one along the similar lines was when the Buddha was encouraging Mahamoggallana to develop jhanas. And then the Buddha left, and Mahamoggallana sat under the tree, and then he said, first jhana, what is first jhana? And then started contemplating the factors of the first jhana. Started basically reflecting upon the description of the first jhana that the Buddha gave. And then by understanding what that was, he developed it. There is no delay or discrepancy between understanding and establishing your mind. That's why the Buddha would praise the jhanas in themselves as well, because even without a right view, you're going to develop a lot of understanding in regard to the nature and the basic characteristics of the universal aspects of your experience. So say a person without a right view develops the jhanas, they're going to need very little instruction to become an arahant, because they've already done most of the work through that correct establishment of the mind.
Another concept that comes up quite often in the traditional literature regarding concentration is the Nimitta, generally translated as like sign, broadly speaking. They discuss that in terms of generally like a light that one has arise when they have a kind of a stage of concentration, and then you manipulate it and focus on it more, and things like that. Anyway, I think we've spoken about kind of why it doesn't really seem to make much sense in the context of composing the mind already.
Well, even in the suttas in general, nimitta is always means signs and tokens of the experience. Like, oh, what's the significance of this? And exactly, so you can say, oh, the significance is this light or something, but that's not. That's just another perception, a more general perception, a more ambiguous perception. Nimitta is the signs and tokens behind the particular perceptions. Yeah, you perceive those signs and tokens, but only in that indirect manner. If you directly look at it, means something else is the significance of your direct look. And again, we don't have to go further than that simile, that sutta that you read, where the thoroughbred horse, he doesn't get absorbed with the golden nimitta of the color of the hay. No, he looks at what's the significance of me being fed this hay, as in what is the horse trainer going to ask me to do because of this? What's the background? That's the nimitta. So exactly, developing discernment of the background means already you are not being pulled by the particular things in your foreground, so to speak. So developing that kind of discernment of the background means developing the nimitta in that particular regard to that experience.
So as kind of a crude example, just because it's a very kind of vague term, like a sign and token of things. And let's say we have a literal sign, like a stop sign.
Right.
The nimitta is not like the
actual sign.
The sign. It's what is
the meaning of stop. Don't pass this line. Exactly. That's the nimitta. Yeah. But most people would think nimitta is the sign. It's the actual physical board that says stop, but it isn't. There is an object that you're perceiving that has the nimitta of certain implication of don't go past this point. So that's the nimitta, and nimitta is always in that background. So particular things in your experience that you through your perception point obviously at various backgrounds, and that's why the signs and the tokens of the mind, because the mind is always on that background. Even the sign of the mind, chitta nimitta, that's almost like a prerequisite for the right view, for sotapatta. Means basically you need to know the direction of that development of mind in order to begin to develop your mind. That's why chitta nimitta is a prerequisite for samadhi.
And here's the sutta that kind of goes into that. That's from the Book of Sixes of the Anguttara Nikaya, Sutta 68. It says, Bhikkhus, for a bhikkhu who delights in company, who takes pleasure in company, who engages in delight in company, who delights in a crowd, so on and so forth, crowd, that he should enjoy being alone and secluded is not a possibility. Not enjoying being alone and secluded, that he should pick up the sign of the mind is not a possibility. Not picking up the sign of the mind, that he should fulfill right view is not a possibility. Not having fulfilled right view, that he should fulfill right composure is not a possibility. Not having fulfilled right composure, that he should abandon the fetters is not a possibility. Not having abandoned the fetters, that he should realize Nibbana is not a possibility.
It's kind of self-explanatory based on all the previous things I've said. It's just exactly that, the perpendicular development. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but by being withdrawn from the people, by being restrained from the senses, you start finding peace in solitude. By being in solitude, you start to see the background of your mind clearer, because you're not constantly bombarded by the sense pull, as in by the particular content. By not being bombarded by the sense pull, by being properly established in that solitude, you start to discern the significance of that background, the nimitta of that background, the signs and tokens of that background, which is that mind. And that's how you develop the understanding. And that's how you begin to practice right view. There is no correct samadhi without a right view, as that sutta and many other suttas would often say. And that's another thing that people often choose to ignore because they find meditation helpful. Nobody says you should stop trying to meditate, but don't think you know how to meditate rightly unless you have the right view.
Here's another sutta dealing with signs and tokens. This is from the 47th Samyutta, the Satipatthana Samyutta, the 8th sutta. It's called the Cook. It says, suppose a foolish, inexperienced, unskillful cook were to present a king or a royal minister with various portions of curries of various flavors. That foolish, inexperienced, unskillful cook does not pick up the sign of his master's preference. Today this curry pleased my master, for he reached for this one, he took a lot of this one, he spoke and praised this one, or that one, and so on and so forth. That foolish, inexperienced, unskillful cook does not gain clothing, wages, or gifts. For what reason? Because in this way, this foolish cook does not pick up the sign of his master's preference. So too, bhikkhus, some foolish, inexperienced, unskillful bhikkhu dwells contemplating the body and the body, ardent, aware, mindful, having removed covetousness and displeasure in regards to the world. While he dwells contemplating the body and the body, his mind does not become concentrated or composed. His defilements are not abandoned. He does not pick up that sign, and so on with the other three satipatthana. So it seems here almost like intuition when it's described in this simile.
Yeah, it means basically knowing what you do, knowing what you're doing. So you don't know what you're doing in the beginning, but you're learning by seeing the results of it, by seeing the implications of it, by seeing how it affects things. Then after a while you become skilled, that cook becomes skilled, he doesn't even have to think, he knows exactly how to please the king. He knows exactly what he likes to eat on what days, and after he's been eating this or that. Why? Because he's been looking at it. He wasn't just looking at, oh, he ate this, he didn't eat this, that's it. I'll just make this, I won't make that. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. But in order to see that, you must stop being concerned and absorbed only with what you see, directly with your perception. You need to start seeing things indirectly in that background that are there, simultaneously present with whatever else you're perceiving. And the same goes actually even contemplating body in the body correctly. It's already that. When you step into the background in regard to your body, that's how the body is twice doubly present, so to speak. Background in regard to a particular experience is the background of that particular experience, which means it's inseparable from, which means you can be absorbed with the body, or if you reflect mindfully upon body, then you see body in that body, because you create a buffer zone by stepping back into that general without looking at it in the same direct particular manner. So you leave, okay, there is a body here, and now there's you mindful of yourself seated paying attention to this particular body. So that's body in the body. It's not like see the body further within the body, further within the body, further within the body, because that's not even you lost the sight of the initial body, let alone seeing the further bodies.
So when it's saying here that the unskilled bhikkhu, he's trying to contemplate the body and the body, or feelings and feelings, or whatever, yet he's still at the same time, he's not becoming composed, he doesn't pick up that
Well, actually,
sign.
when that unskilled bhikkhu, it's actually relatively skilled for the contemporary practices of meditation. He's at least doing body in the body correctly. The Buddha didn't dispute that. But then he says that on account of that practice, he doesn't look further. He doesn't see the signs and the signs and the tokens of that experience of mindful body in the body, because that's how you get to understand it. But initially, he's correct. His practice of body in the body, ardent, resolute, withdrawn from sensuality, he's doing that very well. What I'm saying is that most of the meditation approaches people take today, they don't even do that correctly. They focus on like imaginary body within the further imaginary. Well, it's not even a body anymore. It becomes theories and almost like abstract notions that you perceive, that you think you're perceiving. But in order to perceive them in any shape or form that you believe you can, it will require you to step outside of your experience. So while you're thinking of perceiving means all you're doing is engaging in a view that you are outside of your experience, as in seeing yourself in that impersonal manner, independent of the five aggregates and of what has arisen. So that's what I mean, that's not even seeing the body, let alone seeing the body in the body. But now you have to go further. For somebody who does learn how to do properly composure based on mindfulness of body within the body, then he needs to start looking at the background of that. And that's how he develops signs and tokens in regard to that experience.
In the background of him doing mindfulness of the body.
Well, the tokens, the signs and tokens of the experience of being mindful of body in the body. That's not something you can do. That's something that you can discern based on the principles of discernment that you've been cultivating up to that point. But if you don't, that's what Buddha says, the foolish monk. Because he didn't take it as far as he could have, should have.
So I wanted to start explicitly discussing jhana itself. Is there any particular English translation that is appropriate for jhana, or does nothing really seem to fit?
Well, whatever you choose to translate it with is going to require lots of explanation because all the views associated with it. So no translation will be perfect. Well, leaving it untranslated is not perfect either, because it needs to be understood.
But we at least establish it's like...
I kind of end up referring to it as establishments of mind. I know it's a bit awkward, it's not a concise terminology, but maybe I'll think about it, see if I can come up with one word that I'll be satisfied with.
Right, we established previously that it's along the lines of composing the mind.
Yeah, let's call them the first jhana is the first composition. Samadhi is composure, practice of composure. Jhana is the composition. So something like that.
Can there be samadhi that isn't jhana though?
Yeah, sure. I mean, samadhi, as in composure of your mind, you can compose it in regard to various approaches, various ways of looking at things. But it's really if your mind is developed to a sufficient extent, then you can say it's the extent of the first jhana or the second jhana, even if your practice is not necessarily the practice of jhana. You might be doing other types of mindfulness and meditation.
Okay, so I'll read the formula for the first jhana.
First jhana is basically a way of attending to certain aspects of your experience with a developed mind. That's how you establish, that's how you compose that first jhana that is outside of the sensual domain. We're gone.
Quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome phenomena, with thinking and pondering, and with rapture and happiness born of seclusion, he enters and dwells in the first jhana.
Enters and dwells means he spends time in it.
So we can go into discussing perhaps each of these pairs of factors. First is secluded from sensual pleasures. So seclusion. Some people say that in jhana you don't experience the senses at all, and that's why you're secluded.
No, quite the opposite. You've surmounted the senses, which means they're very much the full extent of the sense domain is right in front of you. And the reason why people can never be aware of the full extent is because they give in to the pull of the sense object way too soon. If you don't give in, then the positive object and the negative sense, the whole domain becomes, discerned. And that's why the first jhana, in another sutta, the Buddha said the first jhana is assailed by the perceptions of sensuality. That's what's trying to undermine your first jhana. It's basically stepping back and seeing the whole picture, the whole nature of sensuality, senses and sense objects. So those senses still remain subjected to the pull of the objects, but you have surmounted them, which means you don't share that nature anymore. You don't partake in it. You are not being pulled. The senses remain. The senses and sense objects are a natural, indispensable counterparts. They define each other. They're inseparable. So you don't shut them down. You find a way out without interfering with them, without trying to deny them. So you leave them alone. That's why what I said in just a few minutes ago is that you free yourself from that sensuality, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, by surmounting the domain of the body being there, this body present right here. Because that's what your senses are. The body is the five senses.
So if you establish like a mindfulness of the body there, you've established like the condition for the senses, so to speak.
Yeah, it's the right direction to go. But you will know that you are outside of the central pole when you have experienced the relief from the central pole, which is undeniable. But in order to experience relief from the central pole, means you need to understand and fully see the extent of the central pole. Not just replace it with something else you think it's more lofty to look at.
So paired with that is secluded from unwholesome states.
Second, unwholesome states of craving that always results then in craving for or against, lust, ill will, delusion, distraction. Distraction means dependence on the variety of the content, boredom, all that. Rooted in the same domain.
So we're saying then that there's also no craving in regards to like any kinds of like, put it crudely, like mental phenomena, so to speak.
There is no. You're not trying to get rid of it either, which is unwholesome. You're not trying to get rid of it either. Because they're like, oh, sensuality is bad, I must get rid of it. Sensuality is bad, I must surmount it and learn how to stop interfering with it. Because you interfere with it either by giving in or trying to get rid of it. So that's exactly why the first jhana is secluded from sensual pleasure, from unwholesome states. So you're secluded from it, but you're not trying to get rid of it either. You leave it alone, because it's not your problem anymore. It's not your debt, it's not your pressure, it's not your duty and your burden. It means, oh, I am relieved from this.
Then it has the words vitaka and vichara here translated as just thinking and pondering. Traditionally, vitaka is like, the Visuddhimagga mentions like the initial strike of the mind as object.
Right.
Vichara
Yeah, I don't want to go
involving.
into commentarial definition. It doesn't matter. The point is, once you have surmounted, once you have fully discerned the extent of the body, the extent of sensuality, and its corresponding pull, once you're disengaged from it, so to speak, what's left there is thinking and pondering. Which means it's the same thinking and pondering minus sensuality.
So you're still engaged with it, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. But now there is nothing to fear, there is nothing to try to get rid of, because thinking and pondering was never the problem. He was thinking and pondering about the senses, about the sense objects, about the sense avoidance, about the sense lust, and so on. That was the problem. So it was lust, aversion, delusion, they were the problem, always were. Once you live withdrawn from it, then thinking and pondering can stay. That's exactly what defines the first jhana. You've surmounted the body, and now what's right in front of you? Usually what's right in front of people is this body with the sense options and sense pulls and sense engagement. But through the discernment of that background, of that simultaneously present background in regard to your particular sense objects, you have developed discernment of a phenomenon of a whole domain of the body. And then what's in front of you is the thinking and pondering. Not anymore the counterpart of your senses, which is sense objects. If you sort of not turn away, if you stop being mindful of thinking and pondering correctly, you are back onto the lower level, which is the level of sensuality. That's why somebody without the right view, somebody who hasn't understood the nature of assumption, the nature of upadana, even if they have jhanas, after the jhana they will go back to the sensuality. They could go back to sensuality. But if once you are withdrawn, paired there with the right view and right understanding, you won't be going back to it, even if you're not in the jhana anymore.
And then rapture and pleasure born of that seclusion.
Yeah.
So I think that you mentioned before, like the joy of freedom.
Yeah, the relief. Imagine you have a pressure, like a debt to pay back, and you know, the debt collectors are there out for you. You don't know when they're going to pounce and come and impound your house and take away and whatever, imprison you. So it's a big burden, it's a big stress to carry. And it's a definition of a sensual world. There's always something pressuring you, pulling you, going against you. So you stepping outside of the entire possibility of the sensual world and sensual pulls, it's a tremendous relief. That's why first jhana is more than enough to become an arahant, an anagami.
And the Buddha mentions in some suttas that unlike pleasure of the senses, there's nothing blameworthy about this.
Yeah, because you can't crave for more of a relief. You're either relieved of that which was a problem, or you're not. If you're relieved from a problem, means there's no more problem whatsoever. It's a full relief. So you can't crave for more of it. It's just inconceivable.
So in
that's why you can't crave for more of the pleasure of the relief, the pleasure of the jhana. If people crave for it, if people think, oh, you can't have enough of it, or you need more of it, that's just another sensuality. That's the definition of sensuality. Wanting more, needing more.
So in that context, it may be getting a little ahead, but like in terms of like the further jhanas, then obviously they become more refined and more things.
It's the refinement of the same principle. So as I said, you have abandoned the counterpart of your sense objects, of your sense basis, of your body, which is basically the sense object is the counterpart. And what's in front of you is the thinking and pondering. But then you can go further and abandon thinking and pondering. Then what's in front of you is the clarity of your mindfulness and so on. And that's why often it would carry on into those other kind of immaterial establishments. By following the same principles, the four jhanas, then, oh, well, is there more? Well, the phenomenon of space, the phenomenon of consciousness, the infinity of space, and so on. And then eventually the cessation of perception and feeling, and there is no more than that. But as I said, whether it's cessation of perception and feeling, or it's the first jhana, the principle of the establishment is the same. That's why the first jhana is sufficient for arahantship. Because it's upon the understanding of the principle that you develop the liberation and wisdom.
Accompanying this, sometimes a simile is given. I'll read out the one that the first jhana has. This is from Digha Nikaya number 2. It starts with the reading. It starts with the first jhana formula, and then it says, "He fills this very body with rapture and happiness born of seclusion. He suffuses this very body with it. He makes the very body full of it. He pervades the very body with it, so that there is nothing in the entire body which is not pervaded by this rapture and happiness born of seclusion." And then he gives a simile of like sprinkled some bath powder and kneading it with moisture and stuff. So it seems to me this could be very easily misconceived as like an energy flow exercise.
Sure.
So how should we understand it properly?
Again, you have to come back to that notion of relief. So imagine you've been harassed by something, say a wild animal that you've been chained to. When the animal ran, you were just dragged with it. Then you were either basically at the mercy of an animal, or you had to fight it back and constantly drag it and sort of dig your heels in and endure it. And if you don't know that the problem is not the animal, but you being bound up with it, because of that subjected to the things that the animal wants, because of not knowing that, you don't know how to free yourself from it. In other words, people might be blaming what animal wants to get, what animal wants to eat, where he drags you, might be blaming the animal. They don't know how to leave the animal alone, nor do they know how to step outside from the animal range. But if you do, then you can literally have it sitting right in front of you, but you know you won't go there with your hand. You won't get hooked again onto it. And if you're not hooked, it won't do anything to you. So it's mindfulness of that relief in regard to the extent for which you neither indulge nor deny, nor try to get rid of. So recognizing the right amount, discerning it. That's another sutta where the Buddha said the monk doesn't attain the jhana because he does not attend to the theme of the jhana. Basically, he does not attend to the theme of the extent that he needs to develop. Of extent of not completely ignoring, but not completely indulging either. Not trying to get rid of, but not pretending it's not there as well. So that's why in order to attend to the theme of something, you need to know what that theme is. You need to have a hint, you need to have signs and tokens of that theme. And the simile the Buddha gave is that cow, the mountain cow that wants to go to the pastures that hasn't been before, and then steps on one rock, but without sort of steadying itself in it regularly, he wants to step on the other one and then falls in between the two. So jhana is not like a culmination of some practice. Jhana is the right practice. That's the there is no culmination to it. The joy of jhana is the joy of doing it, so to speak, in that correct manner, which is a manner of non-doing pretty much. That's why you can't crave for it. You can crave only for something that's an object. You can't crave for something that has no goal in it. So the goal of jhana is the doing the theme of jhana, not the result of jhana. The pleasure of jhana is the pleasure of doing the jhana. Oh, he pervades it like this, he pervades it like that, he thinks, he ponders, he withdraws, he steadies it. That's where the pleasure comes from. Usually people think, I'll do this, I'll meditate, I concentrate, and then I have the experience, and that's jhana. The culmination of joy and whatever light, that's my jhana. No, jhana is that doing, which means you can be doing the jhana without still getting the pleasure of jhana. That's why your mind hasn't been steadied in the jhana, but that doesn't mean you're not doing the jhana. That's why, again, as I said before, you can do other practices that would equal to the strength of the mind of the jhana, but not steady your mind in jhana. The pleasure of jhana is the pleasure of doing it, which means people should stop expecting the great kind of tremendous fountain of joy pouring out as an ecstatic result of their concentration practice, but instead focus on discerning and fully understanding what the theme of jhana is, which is a theme of surmounting the sensual domain, and then do it. And through doing it, it's going to become pleasant doing it. And once you become established upon that pleasure and experience that relief that, oh, while I'm engaged like this, while I'm established like this, no amount of unwholesome can enter me. And that's just a tremendous relief. And that's what pleasure of jhana is. Pleasure of doing it rightly. And then is there further? There's a second jhana. Is there further? There's a third. There is a fourth jhana. So it's very sort of, it can be a big obstacle for people, the ingrained assumption, and I'm speaking from my own experience, the expecting like jhanas or whatever samadhi to result in this experience that kind of overwhelms you. But actually it doesn't result in it, you build it, and through building it, that's where your pleasure gets experienced. And that's why you can't crave for it. Because it's not something that's given that you want. It's either you do it or you don't do it. If you don't do it, you can't have it. So it's inconceivable to even crave it. So steadying the mind in the theme of jhana is the practice of jhana. Even if there is no pleasure in regard to it yet, there is a practice of jhana. He's cultivating jhana. He's steadying his mind in the jhana. He's attending to the theme of jhana rightly. If that's developed to sufficient degree, through sufficient repetition and diligence, again, that's why we always praise diligence as well, because it's not given, then you will recognize that that experience in itself is the experience of that joy and freedom from that, freedom from pressure, freedom from pull that you haven't been recognizing. Why? Because you haven't fully discerned the theme of the jhana, the extent of it. Because that's the whole point. You live next to that wild beast that drags you left and right, but you don't recognize when that beast is left alone. By not recognizing, you don't know how to cultivate it. So you keep interfering with it, and you keep paying the price.
So if someone has the idea like I want jhana, they don't understand jhana.
Exactly. I want jhana. They should divorce that idea from the almost natural expectation. Oh, I want that great experience of pleasure, because that's just another craving for pleasure, which is another craving for sensuality. That's why, as the Buddha said, most people end up meditating with sensuality. So if somebody wants the jhana, and you should want jhana, then somebody must make all the effort to understand what that jhana is, phenomenologically, mindfully, to be seen for what it is, the extent. Because again, the Buddha didn't say, oh, the monk doesn't know what jhana is and he falls between these two rocks, same like the cow between those rocks, sorry. He said the monk doesn't attend to the theme of the jhana, because not attending this particular extent, so not too much, not too little, this is the theme, by not attending it, he doesn't establish it. Which means he has it, everybody has it. But nobody knows what it is, that's why they can't attend to it rightly. And that's why they expect it wrongly, so to speak.
So it's basically that you're saying, if please correct me if I'm wrong, that it's like it's the pleasure of understanding a jhana is the pleasure of the jhana.
Yeah, sure. Once the mind has recognized itself being established in that jhana, that's already that pleasure of that jhana.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. It's like if you don't know you're relieved, then you're not relieved.
Yeah. That's why you cultivate the pleasure of jhana. It's not given to you through some practice of some technique or something, and then the pleasure of jhana comes over you. If pleasure is like that, that's the pleasure you can crave for. And if you can crave for it, means it's not the pleasure of the jhana. Because as the Buddha said, that pleasure is wholesome because you can't crave for it.